IVM.
So let's just say the last few months have given us ample opportunities for difficult conversations, and we've all probably tuned into a virtual presentation at some point or the other. Communication has been such a critical part of getting through this situation, whether with stakeholders in our businesses or even as my 7-year-old tries to make sure she's heard in her virtual classroom. But how much emphasis is given to communication skills in school or at work? Do we take these skills for granted? Today we have among us someone who is known as a master of communication. Matt Abrahams is a passionate, collaborative, and innovative educator and coach. He teaches effective virtual communication and essentials of strategic communication at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. Matt is also the co-founder and principal at Bold Echo Communication Solutions, a presentation and communication skill company based in Silicon Valley that helps people improve their presentation skills. Matt recently published the 3rd edition of his book, Speaking Up Without Freaking Out, a book written to help the millions of people who wish to present in a more confident and compelling way. The one thing we have in common is that he's also a podcaster like me and hosts the Stanford GSB podcast called Think Fast, Talk Smart. Can't wait to tune into that, Matt. Welcome to the show, and it's great to have you with us today.
It is wonderful to be with you, and I look forward to your feedback on the podcast.
I will definitely share some. So Matt, getting right into it, can you share a little bit of background on how you got started with communications, presentations, and public speaking?
Well, it's a rather embarrassing story, and it's a story that brings back many scary memories for me. So when I was a young boy, when I was about 14 years old, I was a freshman in high school, and on the first day of class, our English teacher, Mr. Meredith, I remember his name vividly, had each of us start by saying, "What was it that you did this summer?" And I, of course, with the last name Abrahams, went first because he went in alphabetical order. And I shared my summer experience, etc. And at the end of class, he came up to me and he said, "Matt, you're good at this talking stuff. I need you to go to a speech and debate tournament this coming weekend." And being a freshman, I had no idea what that meant, but I knew I should do what my teachers told me. And so I prepared a speech. I show up on a cold Saturday morning. My pants are too tight. My tie, my father had to tie because I didn't know how to do it at the time. And I walk into this room. And oh my goodness, lots of people. There were parents of my friends who were judging. My friends are in the room. The girl I liked was in the room. And so I'm very nervous, so nervous that it caused a problem. You see, my speech was on karate, something that was very important to me then and still is today. And I forgot to put on my special karate pants. And here's why that's really important. I started my speech with a karate kick to get everybody's attention. But because I had my normal pants on, I ripped my pants from belt loop to zipper in the first 10 seconds of a 10-minute speech. And at that moment, I learned the impact anxiety can have on communication. And from that moment, I've really studied it academically, done research on it, and developed a whole career around teaching and helping people feel more comfortable and confident when speaking. So my beginnings of interest in communication come down to one very cold, embarrassing morning. So thanks for bringing that up. No.
Well, that's definitely a memorable moment.
It was.
If there ever was one. We all have a fair idea about what communication means, or we think we do. But I've often heard you speak about strategic communication. So what does that mean?
So strategic communication, from my perspective, really refers to goal-based communication. So I believe all communication, especially high-stakes communication, needs to have a goal. And strategic communication is simply the study of goal-based communication that's driving towards some kind of behavior change, attitudinal change, etc. So it's a subset of communication that tends to be high stakes and highly goal driven.
Okay. I mean, when you're talking about it, it sounds like all communication should be goal driven.
It eliminates things like chit chat or, sometimes humor and just less consequential communication. But yeah, I would agree that most high stakes communication should be strategic in nature.
Right. So, as I mentioned in my introduction, these times have been quite challenging for all of us, especially as leaders of organizations, in terms of communicating with various stakeholders. So, in our case, for example, it was about having difficult conversations with employees, with investors, with landlords, various people, right? How important is it for leaders to be vulnerable and communicate authentically?
I believe it's absolutely critical, especially in times like we're living today. It is absolutely crucial for people to be authentic, to be empathetic, to take the time to check in and connect with people. There's a lot of pressure in business in particular to just get the job done. But if we don't take time to take care of ourselves and others, it can be problematic. And a great way to do that is through our communication. Really think about what are the values that you hold true? What are the values your organization holds true? And then act accordingly. These are trying times. And even when the times aren't as trying, it really does help to be warm and empathetic and authentic.
So, let's go into that a little bit more. What is the number one challenge for communication you've seen for companies internally with teams or externally with clients? How do people overcome these challenges? And firstly, what are these challenges?
So that's a very broad question. My initial answer is we often start our communication in the wrong place. We start by thinking about what do I want to say? What do I want to say? And I would argue that's exactly the wrong place to start. Instead, we need to think about what does my audience need to hear? So it's about what your audience needs rather than what you want. And that sounds like I'm just playing with words, but in fact, it's a fundamentally different approach. If you focus on your audience needs, then it means you have to do reconnaissance, reflection, and research into who they are, what motivates them, what knowledge they have, what resistance might they bring to the communication. So if you were to ask me broadly, where do people make a mistake? It's fundamentally where they start. So instead of saying to yourself, here are all the things I need to say, think about the topic you need to communicate, but then think, what does my audience need to hear relative to this topic? And that to me is a great place to start, and it will help you be more effective and more relevant to the audience you're speaking to.
Right. And, you talked that actually makes sense, when you say it. And when you mentioned earlier about creating a culture, not just sort of during a crisis, but in general. So how can a company create this culture of open communication and collaboration? Is this it's not just about this open door policy that we've always heard for years,
right?
What does that actually mean? How do you translate that into practice?
That's a great question, and it's a really, really important one. I was smiling as you were saying open door policy. I had a boss, and he was a very good boss, but he used to say, my door is always open. Come by with any questions. And he was right. His door was open, but he was never in his office. So it was an empty promise, right? And so we have to walk the walk and talk the talk. And so some things that I suggest to the organizations that I consult with and the business school students I teach who are going to go out and be the next wave of leaders is you need to build communication in as a fundamental value and spend the time investing in it. So it's not just taking the time to talk to people, but putting in the infrastructure and the processes to support it. So let me give you a couple examples. What would it be like if at the end of every meeting that you participate in, you spent 30 seconds to a minute just debriefing with everybody in the room about the communication that transpired, not the actual content, but how you covered the content. Reward the people that did things well, like taking time to paraphrase or compliment somebody. Give some constructive feedback about how you went down a rabbit hole or a tangent. That's how people learn, is taking that time to reflect. So if you build that into the culture, into the ethos of the company, that matters. If as part of performance reviews, you take time to talk about people's communication skills and help coach people along the way to develop their communication skills, all of a sudden communication becomes more vital and central to the organization, and only good things happen when you focus on communication like that. So you can build it into a culture, but it takes an investment in time, an investment in resources. But in so doing, you benefit in lots of ways.
Absolutely. So, of course, especially over the last few months, virtual communication is the new norm. How, is the advent of the digital workplace changing communications? What are the trends you're seeing in the next 5-10 years? And one thing I want to sort of also, from my personal experience, share is that, of course, we've all done what we had to do, with Zoom meetings and etc. But I still believe that nothing beats being in the same room. And so how do you kind of see this whole virtual communication actually taking over, or the impact it's going to have?
Yeah, so clearly what happened with the global virus, COVID-19, is it forced people to be virtual in ways that we weren't, in some cases, ready for, prepared for, and it expedited a lot of things that were already underway. I agree that there are things that happen in person that are just very difficult and challenging to do when virtual. But at the same time, I would argue that there's some things you can do virtually much better than you can do in person. So I believe in the future, we will have a nice blend of virtual and physical communication. The hard part for everyone now is we went abruptly into almost exclusively virtual, and that feels really hard for people. So, the thing is, when you boil it down, the two biggest challenges with virtual communication are presence and engagement. How do I come off as authentic, trustworthy, warm when I'm talking to a camera and not a person, right? And we're not in the physical space. And then the other challenge is, how do I engage my audience? The trick or challenge with virtual communication is you are sitting on the most technologically developed, engaging, enticing device humankind has ever created, your computer, and we're asking you to pay attention to me and not all of that other stuff going on. So how do you do that? And so for years now, back at Stanford, many years ago, before the situation we're in, I taught a class on effective virtual communication. And the issues were the same then as they are today. The tools have developed considerably. And to get to one part of your question about what are the trends I see, the trends that I am aware of, and I stay in touch with all the major manufacturers of the technology we're using, the Zooms and the Google Meets of the world. And they're really trying to provide feedback and information in a way that can become helpful to you as a communicator. The biggest challenge with that is not to distract you. So they're going to be able to tell you, are people looking at the screen? Are people paying attention in terms of what their eyes are doing? They can do retinal scans and other. These are all coming in the future. The problem is, how do they give us as the communicator that information in a way that's useful in real time? If it's a dashboard that distracts me from being engaged with you, then it's actually not helping. So the interesting thing will be to see how can we benefit from additional information about presence and engagement in a way that doesn't distract us. So think things like haptics. So we already are wearing watches that vibrate instead of beep. And is there a way that we can get physical sensations to give us feedback? And so there's going to be some really neat stuff coming, but it's going to take a while. So I really do think that eventually we're going to have virtual and in-person communication living side by side. And I tell people we have to become bilingual. We have to be fluent in virtual communication and in-person communication. And for some of us right now, it's like being the first week or two in a foreign language class. And it's just, I can ask where the bathroom is, but nothing else, right? And so we have to learn how to do more of that. And it will come with time. All of us now, I think, feel more comfortable than we did, let's say, 2 or 3 months ago. So it's just a process.
So, I do agree with you that, for example, us being able to do this, wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't sort of adopted this whole virtual format for, podcasts. And so I think there's definitely benefits to it. But which communication skills do you believe aren't affected by these upcoming changes in technology, and therefore are necessary to be learned by any communication professional?
So content is content. there are some things you have to do to tweak your content, but things like having a goal, as we mentioned earlier, having a structure to your content, making sure that it's relevant, that's the same regardless of if you're writing or speaking online or in person, in real time or asynchronous. Those foundational skills about making content relevant to your audience, having it structured, that applies regardless. That doesn't change. There's some tweaks around the edges you do, but anybody wishing to improve any kind of communication needs to get those fundamentals down for sure.
And I've heard your sort of TED Talks online, and
yes.
It's really interesting because you might prepare it for a physical audience, but it's actually being heard by so many more people online. So it's very interesting that you kind of, like you said, the content is king, and that is going to be relevant whether you're listening in person or through a screen. So I definitely agree with you on that. What are your favorite communication tools right now? Are there any that you feel are really sort of unknown, underused, underappreciated that we all have access to?
So let me share a couple things. Some actually require some money. So I'll share a couple of those, and then just a real quick but very important common one. So the tool that I use most regularly is a tool that helps me get through my email. And email is a ubiquitous form of communication. And it is a tool that helps me be more productive in my email. The tool is based on the zero inbox principle. And what it essentially does is it takes away distractions. So it allows me to focus on my email, and with some very quick keyboard shortcuts, it helps me get through things more quickly. And it is by far the most frequently used communication tool that I use to help myself be more effective in my communication. It's a tool called Superhuman. And it really does make me feel superhuman when I use it.
I need that in my life. I was like waiting for you to reveal the name. I was like, what is this?
So I was fortunate enough to meet the founder of the company and some of the consulting I do. And not only is he a fantastic guy, but when he said, "Oh, I'm going to help you be more effective in your email," I go, yeah, right. And then he showed me, and I said, "Oh my goodness!" Anyway, I don't have to become an evangelist for it. It has changed my life in terms of my efficiency. There are some tools that I really like for helping people with their vocal communication. So there are a couple of them that I will mention here. One is called Ambit, one is called Like So, another is called Ori. These are tools, another one's called Voice Vibes. They vary in terms of their pricing, but what they do is they help you see some of your verbal habits that you can then become aware of and change. So the easiest example I think people can understand is sometimes people use filler words, ums and uhs and likes. These are tools that will help you become aware of when you're using them and how frequently you're using them, because the reality is you can't change that until you're aware that you're doing it. So tools like Ori, Ambit, Like So, Voice Vibes, those are tools that help. But the tool that every single one of your listeners should be using is a voice memo, or simply using their video camera. When you practice a spoken message, you should be recording yourself, listening to it, watching it, so you can see what others will see. And that's something that everybody has. If you use Zoom, if you use Meet, whatever the tool is, they have recording features. Practice, record, watch. It is painful to watch yourself, but you will learn so much by listening and learning. And in fact, I require my students to watch their recording without sound and then listen to it without watching it as well, because you pick up on little things that you distract yourself with in other ways. So the tool everyone should use is your voice memo in your recording, and then there's some video recording, and then there's some other tools that I mentioned that if you want to pay for them, I think can be helpful.
That's very interesting. And I was so conscious before getting on this, this recording with you, that I have to be conscious of my ums and likes and, all the filler words that you exactly mentioned. So I'm going to get these tools right away.
When the woman who became my wife went on her first date with me, and she said, "Oh, what do you study?" I said, nonverbal communication. I kid you not, she sat with her hands folded at the table, staring straight ahead for the first hour and a half of our date, because she didn't want me to be reading any signs. So I unfortunately get that a lot. I really don't pay attention to it unless I'm actually coaching or teaching somebody, because I just get engaged in the conversation. But don't worry, you're doing great. You're doing well. A+.
Thank you. So Matt, moving on to sort of focusing on presentation skills.
Mm-hmm.
They say that we fear public speaking even more than death. I don't know how true that is, but it certainly ranks right up there in the top 10 for many people, including me. I'd like to share about the first time I was asked to speak and do a presentation, a rather sort of big one. It was nerve-wracking. And I think the biggest fear is forgetting your script or boring the audience. That was what it was for me. And the classic advice I've heard for stage fright is to imagine the audience in their underwear, but I'm not quite sure of that.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that, of the Brady Bunch advice.
But what would you say, how can individuals overcome this fear of public speaking and build confidence while presenting?
All right. So you need to keep me in check because I have a lot to say on this. So I will try to be concise and clear and not take up the rest of our time just answering this one question. So first and foremost, let me say two things. One, it is completely normal and natural to feel nervous in high stakes communication situations. It is the rare person who is not. Research shares with us that up to 85% of people feel nervous in high-stakes situations, and I think the other 15% are lying. I think we could create a situation that would make them nervous. So it is normal and natural. The problem is we just don't talk a lot about it. So we see people communicate well, and we figure, well, they must not be nervous. Well, the chances are they are nervous. They've just practiced and learned skills to help them manage it. And that brings me to my second point. I don't believe you can ever truly overcome your anxiety around speaking. I believe you can learn to manage it so you can deal with it, but I don't think you can ever overcome it, nor do I think you would want to. I actually believe anxiety is helpful when managed well. It gives you energy, it helps you focus, it tells you what you're doing is important. So the table stakes in dealing with this is first and foremost, everybody has it, or most everybody does, and secondarily, there are tools you can learn to manage it. So now let me get to your question, which how do we do it? Well, I could go on forever. And in fact, you were kind enough to mention my book. There's a website I curate called nofreakingspeaking.com that also gives a bunch of these tools. There are two primary areas we have to focus on: symptomatic relief and then a deal with the sources that actually cause the anxiety. So let me give you one example of each. And then if you wish, we can dive into more. When many of us get nervous, we blush and we perspire, we sweat. That happens to me when I get nervous, and I still get nervous in certain situations. That's because your core body temperature is going up. When you get nervous about speaking, your body invokes the fight or flight response. Your heart beats faster, your blood vessels constrict, therefore your blood pressure goes up. It's like you're exercising, and that's why you perspire. So we need to cool ourselves down. Literally, you need to cool yourself down. And so simply holding something cold in the palm of your hand will cool you down. Your palms are thermoregulators for your body, just like your forehead or the back of your neck if you ever have a fever. So holding something cold can help you blush less and perspire less. And in fact, I bet you on a cold day, you've done the reverse. If on a cold day you've ever held warm tea or coffee and felt it warm you up, we're just doing it in reverse. So that's an example of dealing with a symptom. Now, a source of anxiety is the thing that actually causes you to be nervous. So let me give you one, and there are many, but let me give you one. Many of us get nervous because we're afraid of a potential negative future outcome of what we're doing. So for example, my students are afraid they're not going to get a good grade. The entrepreneurs I coach are afraid they're not going to get funding. You might be afraid you're not going to get support or listeners for your podcast. Those are all potential future states. So if we can cancel that fear of the future, we can reduce our anxiety. And the best way to do that is to become present-oriented, be in the present moment. And you see athletes do this all the time. They'll do something physical like stretch or push-ups. They'll listen to a song or a playlist. These are tools to get you in the present moment. So if you have something that helps you get present-oriented, by definition, you will short-circuit the fear that comes from the potential negative future outcome. So That's a long-winded answer. You can learn to manage your anxiety. It's about symptoms and sources, and I gave you an example of each. So hopefully that's helpful to you and to your listeners.
It makes so much sense when you're saying it. And I know obviously you're a professor in this, so you would know what you're talking about, but it really makes so much sense when you're saying this. But if we were to share a basic framework for our listeners about how you can go about planning and preparing for a presentation to ensure that you convey your message and engage with your audience, what would you advise?
So it's a rather simple process, but takes time. And once you get used to it, it can feel very natural. So first and foremost, once you have a date where you have the high stakes communication, let's say I know it's 2 weeks away. Here's how I'd recommend that you spend that time. The first week or half of your time should be spent developing the content. And if it has slides or demos or other technology, that's included in that development phase. And then the second phase is practice. The reality is most of us don't take time to practice. We're so busy or so nervous, we spend up to the last minute cramming all the material, and then we never practice, which is going to put us at a disadvantage. So my rule is simply cleave the time you have in half. First half is development, second half is delivery. Now, when it comes to development, first and foremost, do not start with slides. Most people today get out every slide they've ever created related to the presentation or meeting contribution they have to make, and then they beg, borrow, and steal others and start there. I call that actually a Franken deck, like Frankenstein is a combination of different body parts. That's how many people create presentations and meeting contributions. So don't do that. Rather, start with who's my audience, what do they need to know, and from that, craft a goal. What am I trying to achieve? Then think about what's the best way to structure my content to achieve my goal, to be relevant to my audience. So it always goes backwards. And then you begin to flesh out your content in that structure. And that structure provides you with a roadmap. And one of the things I heard you mention was a big fear you have is blanking out. Well, it's really hard to blank out if you have a good structure, because if you remember the structure, it will help. I like to say your content, your structure is like a roadmap. It's really hard to get lost if you have a map of where you're going. So by developing that early on and then practicing it, it becomes much easier. So once you have that structure, then and only then do you think about would slides, would a demo, would something additional help? So I suggest doing exactly the opposite of what most people do. Most people say, here are all the things I want to say. What are all the slides I have? Boom, I'm ready to go. And I say, no, what does your audience need? What is your goal? Create a structure, then think about having slides. So that's a process that people can try. And I believe after you do it once or twice, you'll feel very good about it.
Of course, when it comes to practicing a presentation, this is something that can be managed. But often we find ourselves in situations where we have to speak spontaneously, where it's a lot more challenging. Example, when we have to speak to our teams during a crisis, or you're in a meeting and it takes a dimension that, you couldn't have anticipated. How can we learn to speak impromptu with clarity and confidence, regardless of the content and context?
Absolutely. And that is a big challenge, because if we think about it, most of the communication we do is spontaneous. It's walking down the hall with a colleague. It's jumping on a Zoom call and somebody asks for feedback. Somebody asks you a question and you have to respond. And spontaneous speaking is hard. So I've spent a lot of time working on this problem. In fact, many, many years ago, the associate dean at the Stanford Business School at the time came to me and said, we have polled all of our students and asked them, what can we do to help them be better? And the number one response was students really wanted help on cold calling. I'm sure you remember back when you were in school and the mean, evil professor would point at you and say, what do you think? So that's intense, spontaneous speaking. So from that, I created the whole Think Fast, Talk Smart presentation, and then the podcast came, etc. So in a nutshell, what one has to do first and foremost is alter your approach to the situation. Then you can work on what you say. And so let me just give you a couple things to think about. Many of us in spontaneous speaking take a performance mindset. And a performance mindset says there's a right way to do it. You need to compete to do it. And you need to really focus on doing it right. That puts a tremendous amount of pressure on yourself when you say, I have to do it right. I've been doing this for decades. There is no right way to communicate. There are better ways and worse ways, but there's no one right way. So if you relieve some of that pressure and just say, hey, I just need to get it done. I just need to answer the question. I just need to give the feedback. Because you've removed that pressure to get it right, it actually makes it easier to do a much better job. So we need to get out of our own way. And that is far easier to say than to do. Once we've done that, the next thing we have to do is change the way we see the situation. Many of us see these spontaneous speaking situations as challenges or threats where we have to defend ourselves. When somebody asks me a question, most of us aren't like, oh, yay, thank you for the question. We're like, oh, no, do I know the answer? They're trying to show I don't know what I'm talking about. I might get in trouble. So if we can see that moment when somebody asks for feedback, asks us a question as an opportunity, it's an opportunity to expand what you've said, to help convince somebody of your point of view. Just that mindset change will change the way you approach it, and it'll free up cognitive bandwidth. You'll have more time to reflect and give a better answer. So those are the first two steps and really important steps. And then once you accomplish getting out of your own way and seeing it as a positive rather than a negative, then you rely on structure. And I had already talked a little bit about structure, but whenever you communicate, you have two things to focus on: what you're saying and how you're saying it. If you have a structure you can rely on, then it's already told you how you're going to say it. You just have to think about what to put in the structure. So can I spend 10 seconds explaining my favorite structure?
Absolutely.
Excellent. So my favorite structure in the whole world, just so everybody knows what I mean by structure, is 3 questions. What? So what? Now what? So when you are communicating something, let's say it's a project, a product, an idea, you have whatever, one of those, you say what it is, then you explain why it's important to the person you're talking to the company, to the world. You get to pick where it's important for. And then what are the next steps? That's the now what. So if I know when you're going to ask me a question that I'm going to tell you what my answer is, why my answer is important, and what you can do with that information, all of a sudden the burden I have is halved. Because I know how I'm going to say it. Now I just have to think of what I'm going to put into each of those answers. And in fact, many of my answers to your questions have simply been in the structure, what, so what, now what. So the trick to spontaneous speaking is changing your approach and being really good at using structure. And both of those can be done through practice.
Great. That's really helpful. So I know storytelling plays a huge role in communicating with people. Whenever I've been kind of trained for a big presentation, it's always about being anecdotal, etc. Whether it's a presentation or talk or even just in conversations. And sometimes when I've shared stories about my journey, and maybe because it's happened to me, I don't feel like it's a big deal, but someone else finds it really interesting or inspiring. How can people start using storytelling as a part of their presentations, and what are some of the mistakes they can avoid?
So I did a little research on you, and you have a very compelling story. So absolutely people can take things from it. So a couple things about how to start with storytelling. Stories are conversations. They're conversations that you have with other people. So if we make a storytelling as to be this big thing that you have to learn to tell your stories, all of a sudden it becomes very challenging. But if you just think about it, hey, we tell stories all the time when we're talking to people. It's just conversation. It's a story is nothing more than a logical structure of information. So it's a conversation. So don't make it out to be this big thing. Although you're right, it does help. But we put a lot of pressure to tell stories. So just become more comfortable with it. How do we do it? I believe everybody should take time to stockpile some stories. Think about things you've learned in your life and the situation that led you to learn them, and catalog them, literally writing them down or recording them. So you have a stockpile of stories that you can pull on. You asked me, the very first question you asked me today was about how did I get interested in this? I have told that story about ripping my pants once or twice before, right? It's a story that I have cataloged, and there are many others that I have. And I believe everybody, especially business professionals, should have stories that represent your values, represent themes that you think are really important. So by stockpiling them, by practicing telling them, that helps. Now, in terms of things you can avoid, one of the powers of storytelling is it transports people to that scenario. I could get a lot of my points across just by giving you bullet points, but our brains are wired to remember things episodically. They're wired to remember things in story form, not bullet points. So the vividness, the descriptive detail of stories helps people see it in their mind's eye and therefore remember it. So that's the power of story. The thing to avoid is giving too many details, giving too much information, because when you give too much information, you overwhelm somebody. I want to share with you one of my favorite quotes ever, and it came to me from my mother. I don't know who originally said it, but my mother says this to me all the time, which probably means I should learn to do this. But she says, "Tell the time, don't build the clock." And many of us, when we are telling stories, we become clock builders and we give too much detail and too much information. So the trick of good storytelling is to use vivid detail, use description, but just enough to tell the time, not so much that you build the clock. So the thing to avoid is giving too much detail, providing too much information, because that can overwhelm people.
Yeah, I guess sometimes you have to know how far not to go back into the story.
Absolutely. And another big thing that really helps is building curiosity. There's a wonderful book by a colleague of mine at the business school and his brother. It's called Made to Stick. It's by Dan and Chip Heath. And in it, they talk about 6 key principles that make things stick in people's brains. And the notion of building curiosity that you just pointed out there, don't go too far back, is one of their key points.
So when it comes to communicating data, okay, not something very exciting for a lot of people, how can one transform numbers into, inspirational narratives to actually achieve those goals that you sort of have talked about so much? And how do you weave a story into this?
Yes. So my business partner in my consulting practice has this saying that I really like. She says, you don't want to numb people with numbers. And a lot of us do that. And so it's a great question because many people fail in this regard. So a couple things. First and foremost, we are not designed to receive a data dump. Our brains are not meant to do that. We are much better at understanding stories. So if you can contextualize your data in a way that we understand it better, it helps. So using analogies, using comparisons, explaining what the data mean in terms of the relevance to people, the impact, that can all help. Let me give you a real short example. Early on in my coaching career, I coached a very senior leader at Citibank. And as part of his presentation, he explained how much money goes through Citibank every day globally. The number was astronomical. My bank account will never see that much money, sadly. And it was too big. The number was incomprehensible to me. And I said, so what does that mean? And he did some really quick math. And he said, it's roughly 25% of the world's money every day goes through Citibank. And I said, say that. So say the big number and then immediately say that's roughly 25%. By giving the context, all of a sudden we understand it. So the key to making data relevant is to, 1, don't use too much of it. And then 2, give it context, tell a story about it, make it relevant to your audience. That can help a lot. I just recently heard in this pandemic world where somebody was talking about the number of active cases in a certain area. And they said that's roughly the population of a local town. And that made that number pop alive. I mean, I've been in that town. I know how many people live in that town. That's how many people are actively fighting the virus. That made that number, which to my mind was abstract, very concrete. So that's how I think you enliven numbers.
So it sounds like you kind of really have to get your audience to relate to it, right? So does that sort of require you to firstly even understand your audience so that you can tailor your presentation to better to create that impact that you want with the audience?
Absolutely. Very insightful point. So especially when it comes to data, especially when it comes to science and technology conversations or presentations, you really have to understand your audience. What do they know? What don't they know? Do I have to scaffold their knowledge? Maybe I need to check the acronyms and slang and jargon that I use so that they can better understand me. There's this notion of the curse of knowledge, and it actually comes from that book Made to Stick I mentioned, We all know too much about what we're speaking on, and therefore we make assumptions and take shortcuts that if we don't know our audience, we're going to lose them. I told you I like to be I like to tell stories. When I was in college, I was a tour guide on my college campus. It was the highest paying job I could get, and I was desperate for money. I learned a lot about being a tour guide that helped me be a better communicator. And one of the first things you learn as a tour guide is never lose your tour group. You're a really bad tour guide if you get people lost. And the same thing is true in our presentations and in our meeting contributions. Don't lose your audience. Yet many of us do things like just give a barrage of numbers or lots of bullet points that cause our audience to get lost. So really knowing them, knowing what they know and knowing what they need to know can really help. So your point is very well taken.
Okay. Matt, some practical tips or advice you'd give to an aspiring public speaker? I know that pretty much everything we've been talking about is that, but just, if you had to give,
So a couple things that I would say is, first and foremost, identify key themes that you want to get across. What is it that you're really all about in your messaging that you're putting together? It's amazing to me sometimes that people really haven't thought through what they really hope their audience gets from it. So that's the first step. The second step is to realize that your audience most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time really wants to get something from you. They want to get information. They want to understand more about something. So they're not there to be adversarial. They're there to be supportive. A lot of us go into speaking with this very defensive, negative attitude. So if you change your approach, if you understand your themes, if you take time to practice and get feedback, that can help. My mantra is this: the only way you get better at communication is three things: repetition, reflection, and feedback. So you have to practice. You have to, any sport anybody's ever played, if you play a musical instrument, the only way you got better was through practice. So you have to practice communicating, and you have to challenge yourself to give yourself situations to do that. And then, as we talked about earlier, you need to reflect. You need to take time to say what worked, what didn't work. There's that definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Most of us do that with our communication. We just do the same thing, and we never think, did that work or not? And then finally get feedback. And that's where teachers and coaches and authors and video producers come in handy, because there are a lot of resources and experts who can give you some feedback. I'm a huge fan of Toastmasters, for example, as a resource where people can go to learn better communication. And there are Toastmasters globally all over the world. I'm sure any one of your listeners could type in Toastmasters in their location and they'll find one. So if you want to become a better speaker, really take the time to know your themes, to remind yourself your audience wants to get some value from you, and to allow yourself time and permission to get lots of repetition, take the time to reflect, and get feedback.
Great. So Matt, now we've entered the last segment of our show, which is the rapid fire round.
All right, I'm ready.
That spontaneous response is all we're looking for.
Yes.
I'm going to ask you a few questions and just say the first thing that comes to mind. Who have been your role models or mentors?
So there are several. I will go through them very quickly. My parents have been very significant role models in my life. My mother is incredibly creative. My father is very organized and a very effective communicator. As I alluded to with my horrific 14-year-old boy story, I have done martial arts for almost 4 decades. My longtime instructor in Sensei has been amazingly impactful in my life. And when I was an undergrad, I was very fortunate to study with a famous and also infamous psychologist named Philip Zimbardo. He's responsible for the Stanford prison experiment. He really opened my eyes to the field of communication and how to do research in it. So my parents, and 2 teachers, my karate instructor and a professor I had, were very important role models for me.
Great. Who are the best public speakers in your view, international or Indian, if you know any?
Well, you can't talk about public speakers and talk about India without mentioning Gandhi. And I the ability to move masses of people and to have input and insight and really help people reflect. And what I respect about his communication was it was very concise and clear, and a lot of people are not. There's a female speaker who I admire a lot. She's a young woman, American. Her name is Brittany Packnett. She has amazing ideas around communication and confidence. And as you well know, confidence is something that I really look at. And she talks way beyond the kind of confidence I talk about in terms of just communication. So an amazing speaker. She's got a great TED Talk. I've never met her. I just am in awe of what she says and how she says it.
What's your definition of success?
So I am a lifelong learner and a lifelong teacher. And so to me, success is if other people are thinking and learning and I am thinking and learning, then it's been successful. So to my mind, our interaction here today on your podcast has been very successful. I've learned a lot from you, and I hope that those listening in have learned from me. So to me, I always look, is there a learning to take away from this for myself and others? And if the answer is yes, then I think we've had some success.
Wonderful. I'd be happy with applause at the end of my presentation.
That's great. That's a good sign. People applaud when they get value.
The best investment you've made in your journey?
Giving myself time and permission to make mistakes. And if you're not making mistakes, this is trite, but if you're not making mistakes, you're not learning, you're not taking risks. And the way to get better at anything, but particularly communication, is to be okay with failure. Just because you failed doesn't mean you're a failure. It simply means you're trying something out and learning something. And one of the reasons I love the martial arts so much is it's very humbling, very humbling. You constantly have to learn and improve. And I think that's true in communication as well.
Finally, what would be your message to the young leaders today?
Oh, if I could talk to all the young leaders today, stop sending me emojis. No, it would be focus on your communication, focus on the communication of others. As a leader, your job is to role model effective communication, be empathetic, and encourage others to work on their communication. I believe the best leaders I've had, the bosses I've had, have been the ones who've taken time to really invest in their communication and in my communication. And I think young leaders could spend more time with that. The way we communicate, the way the younger generation communicates is different than the way I grew up communicating, but it is as powerful and as important. And so they need to invest in that.
Wonderful. Matt, this has been a true privilege. Thank you so much for being here today, for taking the time out with all the time difference and everything. And, I really look forward to tuning into your podcast and lots more. So good luck with everything ahead. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much. I have enjoyed the conversation and I enjoyed getting to know you.
Communication can really make or break a situation, whether we're looking at a professional scenario or even a personal situation between spouses, family members. And it really sounds like it's a pretty simple exercise if you just think about it and how you're communicating with people, what you're communicating and what you're trying to achieve. I really hope you got out of my conversation today with Matt as much as I did. I really found it insightful, and I hope you enjoyed tuning in today.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I want to let you all know about 2 new shows that we've launched this week. The first one is Millennial Athlete, hosted by Tanvi and Shlok. Both of them are, they spent their life playing badminton, and they know a lot of athletes, and they want to talk about the particular challenges that athletes face. Really, really great conversations. Do definitely check that out. The other show that I wanted to mention to you that we launched this week is Naan Curry. Naan Curry is a show about food and the history of food and the economics around food and its consumption and all that kind of stuff. It's a really, really interesting conversation. It's hosted by Sadaf, an author chef and former MasterChef India finalist, and Archit, who is a researcher who writes on behavioral science and economics. Definitely worth checking out. Besides that, we had a great week as always, right? Great stuff on all the normal shows. Do check those out. But with that, hope to see you again next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Storysellers for personal stories, analysis and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.